You want to know how to checkmate a world champion? Well, keep watching. This game was played in round 5 of the Grenke Chess Classic. Georg Meier with white. He's one of Germany's strongest players, and Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, is playing with black. Very regular start to the game. It's a Catalan, and Carlsen plays this closed variation of the Catalan. So checking first and then putting the bishop back on e7. So the idea is you slightly displace the white bishop on d2. I actually recommended this system on one of my PowerPlay DVDs, number 24. If you want a good system with black, I would recommend that. And Carlsen plays in the approved way, so not taking on c4, but setting up a strong point on d5 and thus blocking out the bishop on g2. Bishop comes to f4. You have to move that bishop because it gets in the way of the knight. Or, well, you don't have to, but it's recommended to move the bishop anyway. And here the main move is b6, and there's a tricky little idea here that if the knight comes to d2, then you can push the bishop away and play f5, and you already have a nice attack. Better to play knight c3 here, but anyway, that's another story. Do check out the DVD if you want more info on that one. Knight e4 played by Carlsen. So what he's doing is going for potentially a kind of stonewall Dutch setup. He's going to support that knight with f5. Of course, it's an aggressive way to play, and Carlsen wants to target one of the weaker players in the tournament and try to go for a win with black. I mean, he often does go for a win, but there's no doubt that this is a slightly risky way to play. But he has played this before with some success. And here, Meier plays h4, which I have to say, with my human eyes, I don't like. Because although white is discouraging black from playing g5, which is often an important move in the Dutch, to some extent it does a lot of the hard work for black, because you slightly weaken your king position, and you just have a funny feeling if black ever does break through, then the lines are going to be opened. But I should say this is a Houdini recommendation, so recommended by one of the strongest chess engines, but to me not a practical move. Anyway, I have no doubt that Meier had prepared this move. I think h6 is a reasonable response now, so that you're ready at some point to perhaps get in g5, and that would open lines as well. But Carlsen played just knight to f6, supporting the knight, and maybe looking at knight g4 at some point anyway. Knight d2. So sound from Meier. Generally, he's a pretty solid player. I think the thing with h4 is that if this move is successful, if you can successfully block any attack by black, then it's a good move. You know, I like advancing this pawn. But is it going to be successful? Let's have a look. So knight h5 from Carlsen, pushing the bishop back, and now f5. So this is now a serious threat to play f4, and that really would detonate white's position. So I think white's next move is forced, actually. And Meier played this instantly. Bishop f3. And now if f4, I think f4 is just too risky, because you can take, and well, you can see that, well, white is a pawn up. Maybe that's not the most important thing, but the important thing is that it's very hard for black to follow up with any kind of attack, because white is better developed. White has connected the rooks. There's no connection here, so white would be absolutely fine there. So Carlsen instead played queen e8, protecting this knight. And again, f4 could be in the air, so bishop g5 played by Meier. Good move, so gets that bishop out of trouble. And now he plays e3, locking down the possibility of f4. And it's clear to me that white's opening play has been a success, because he's managed to close down black's play on the king side and he has a slight space advantage. And yeah, I think just a very pleasant position for white indeed. So Carlsen needs to sort out the problem of what to do about developing this queen's bishop. I mean, just playing bishop d7 feels very passive. So he played b6, and that also stops white expanding, well, for the time being, with c5. And he puts this bishop more actively on a6. But Meier continues his expansion, or would like to continue his expansion, with b4, and also stops a potential bishop b4 as well. Knight e4 from Carlsen. So the knight throws itself back on the outpost and bishops are exchanged. So that exchange frees black's position to a certain extent. The rooks are connected, the queen's on a better square, but there are now dark square weaknesses in black's position. You can see this is often the problem with the Stonewall Dutch. If white were able to get a knight in on e5, for instance, then he'd be doing very well. So let's see what happens. Bishop e2. So there was obviously a problem here. Black wanted to take on c4, so that just bolsters the c4 pawn. Bishop came back to b7. Yeah, its work there is done. And now if white plays knight f3, white would love to play the knight into e5, but if this is played straight away, then c5, and it's clear that black is getting a lot of play on this diagonal, so that's no good. So instead, Meier sensibly plays b4. So just, trying to shut down this possibility of c5. And white is expanding very nicely here. Again, there might be a possibility of c5, so c5 from white just locks it down. And now there is a clear threat of playing the knight round via f3 into e5. And positionally, that would be superb for white. I would say, kind of in a higher sense, black would be positionally lost there. So Carlsen makes the decision to break with e5. I think a very sensible move. And that's taken. And here, well, there's a couple of very interesting possibilities. I thought at first, maybe just knight f3 and just solidifying the king side and maybe trying to put the knight here. But there's no doubt that black, with this nice knight on e4, should be okay there. Certainly will have counterplay. But very interesting idea is f4. Pushing the queen back and then taking on e4. Now, king g2 to stop black's queen coming in. And you can see that on the king side, white is actually very solid. And if he can gain control, perhaps put a queen on d4, then he could be better on both wings. And you can see that bishop looking awful on c8. But maybe Meier looked at rook d8 and thought, sometimes there could be the possibility to open with d4. And yeah, maybe sometimes bishop c8. I mean, this would be a very ambitious way for white to play. So instead, Meier played a simple move and very quickly. So he was playing very pragmatically. He wasn't hanging around. He just took this dangerous knight off. F takes from Carlsen. And now queen c3. So basically, if queens are exchanged, then there is no doubt that white is better in this position. This bishop looks poor. Nice queenside expansion. So, well, I think instinctively Carlsen knows that that would be a mistake. He wants to keep as much tension in the position as possible, so queen f5. But, of course, it's not nice to leave this queen on a nice diagonal. But, well, needs must. And Meier sees no particular danger on the king side, so starts to expand on the queen side. Good play. And here, well, Carlsen just goes for it with g5. He lashes out. Rook f6 might well have been more prudent, but I think this is starting to get a bit tricky for black. If the attack doesn't break through, then white is just better on the queen side. So Carlsen lashed out with g5. And once again, there's a very interesting possibility of f4. And this looks absolutely crazy. But the idea is if pawn takes pawn, then g4 closes the king side. And with a blockade on d4, that must be very, very good for white. Suddenly the whole situation will swing round and it's white that is attacking here. Maybe pawn takes pawn en passant and queen h3. I mean, it looks terrifying, but in fact after this, white keeps everything under control and it'll be white's turn to attack the king very soon. I mean, it's a really interesting idea, but Meier again played very pragmatically, didn't risk anything, just took on g5 and played king g2. This is the way we would play in a blitz game without thinking, because he just wants to switch a rook to the h file and the initiative can well swing over to white. So Carlsen plays rook c7. He wants to bring rook number 2 over. Rook h1, good move. Rook g7. Now there are threats to take here and take here. So that gets defended against with rook g1. Could play rook f1 here. That might actually save time. But rook g1 does the job as well. And here Carlsen should definitely trade on c5. And if pawn takes, then rook back to f7 and bishop c8. And actually, in this way, black managed to clear up some of the problems on the queen side and activate this bishop. And probably black has enough play there. I still prefer white actually, but it's a tricky position. By the way, in this position, after pawn takes pawn, if queen takes, then the queen comes to f6, hitting here, and then queen b2 with counterplay. Not so clear. So I think that was Magnus's moment where he could have kept some decent counterplay, but instead he played queen f5, hitting f2. That got defended. And now rook a6. So this is his idea. He suddenly spots a tactic and thinks, you know, this is my chance. So, well, what happens? If bishop takes bishop, queen check, and if king back, then it's checkmate. Very nice indeed. Or if the king comes up the board, then rook g6 and rook h6 should do the job. Meier defends against the threat with b5 and Carlsen takes. Now, of course, you don't want to take again because that leads to disaster. So same tactic. But after this, Meier just played rook h5, knocking the queen backwards, and now the game starts to turn. Queen goes back and queen e5. So you can see black's pieces going backwards, white starting to invade, and this is the huge problem when you play a kind of Stonewall Dutch setup with black. If it goes wrong and white gets in, then there's a huge vacuum behind those pawns that the white pieces can flood into. Very double-edged indeed. And here I'm sure that Carlsen will have seen that he could take on c5 and then white would head for an endgame. But this is the kind of endgame that I think if Magnus had white, he would absolutely relish. And I think Georg Meier as well, who's a strong technical player, would also really enjoy this position. Now, if black defends perfectly, he can probably make a draw, but white is going to pick up one of these pawns, and you can see all the pawns are split. Whites are together. Very difficult to find counterplay for black, and white certainly has winning chances in that position. Not a lot of fun to defend, but that's not Magnus's style. He keeps playing actively, but he is running a huge risk here. And here, well, he could try to calm things down a bit. White is still a lot better in that position. But instead he risked even more. He took on a4, allowing white this pass pawn on a7. And this is incredibly risky. Well, if white finds the right way, it's a bit more than risky. And Meier plays excellently to this point. Bishop g4, he's bringing his bishop in. Suddenly, white's attack is coming through. And here he played rook a1. He wants to just clear up those pawns, but it's in this position that he could have checkmated Carlsen, or at least, well, a winning attack. And in fact, there's more than one way to win this. The simplest way, the simplest try in this position is to bring the rook on f1, which is no longer active, bring it to the h file. So that means that all white's pieces are in play. And because of this pin here, this is fatal. Absolutely fatal. It's a kind of slow motion threat, but given that black's bishop is stuck in the corner and there's nothing to attack here for black, there is absolutely no defense. Okay, here's the basic idea, and here's what both players missed. After queen e7, you take on h7. Well, this is fairly obvious. Check. And if the king comes up the board, then both players missed rook h6 check. And if that's taken, queen h5 mate. And if king f7, queen h5, and one of my favourite checkmates actually, with the queen covering the escape square. Of course, after rook h5 check in this position, the king can go backwards, but bishop e6 check will win the game. For example, rook f7. Now, well, if white wants to, then you can take, you can grab the queen straight away, actually, for example, like this. I mean, there are actually better ways of doing this, and there's actually no rush. You can play rook h6. This is a very nice move. I mean, one possibility is, you know, to threaten to bring this over. So bishop c6, queen h5, and this is fatal. And now rook h6, and this is even better. You're going to win the queen or checkmate, basically. So if the queen goes backwards, well, let me show this. Let's say queen d7 for the sake of argument. Then we give a check and we mate on h6. That's just one possibility. But so many ways for white to win in that line with rook h1. That's pretty straightforward. But there are other moves. For example, rook f5, incredibly, is a winning move in this position. Very simple. You trade off one of those, and now there's no defense to an attack on the back rank and possibly on the h file as well. So like this, bishop e6. I mean, the fact is that this bishop is just out of the action here. Threat queen b8 after this move, bishop e6. And if bishop c6, rook b1, and you can see black is tied hand and foot here. There is no way out. Queen h5, followed by rook takes bishop and wins everything. And after rook f5, well, if the rook moves away, let's say rook d8, well, then we'll go back to the h file. And now the point of this is that there is no counterplay here. So after queen f7, you can afford just to play rook h1, followed by bishop e6. Fatal. So that was the winning moment for Meier. Instead, he played rook a1. And after this, they traded heavy pieces. And here they agreed a draw. I think a great pity for Georg Meier, because he played an excellent game. He kept his cool. He played very pragmatically. He didn't run too short of time. Well, a little bit short at the end and missed a mate, but not fatally short of time, which is often where Magnus's opponents come unstuck. Would you have found that win? Who knows? Big pressure against the world champion. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do check out the info tab up there where you can see lots of other playlists and other stuff. Thanks for watching.